So now let's continue our discussion. We explored some basic questions like what is history, and you learned that history is an academic discipline. That is important to remember because there are certain things that are broadly accepted, like the Darwinian theory of evolution, and we talked about that. Darwin formulated this theory of evolution. He lived in the mid-19th century, and this time period when he lived is known as positivism, materialistic approach to life. And he approached the evolution and origins of humankind from that materialistic perspective. And his theory is quite well supported by evidence, by paleontological discoveries, by those fossils that had been discovered throughout the world, particularly in Africa, where humankind originated. The earliest hominid, they were discovered in Africa. Their fossils are from 10 to 3.5 million years. And then later discoveries, like in 1960, in Tanzania, at the site of some 1.75 million years old, paleontologists discovered what became known as Homo habilis, or skillful man. So that really represents this evolution of humankind over time. In 1927 in China, and later in 1950 in Africa, paleontologists discovered many fossils which are dated like 1.6 million years old species. And their brain was significantly larger than brain of this Homo habilis. And these species were about 5 feet tall, or even 6 feet tall. And those species were, they became known, or they were named Homo erectus. They started using fire, and it seems since they were discovered in Africa, they were discovered in China, they were discovered in Eurasia, and it's believed that those species, more advanced, migrated. They moved from Africa and they migrated throughout Eurasia and eventually moved to Australia and would eventually move to the Americas, particularly those creatures which were more advanced, Homo sapiens. About 40,000 years ago, the principal inhabitants of Europe were the so-called the Neanderthal man. They were discovered in modern-day southern France. And then some other discoveries were made earlier in the 19th century, in 1868, Cro-Magnons. They were the earliest representatives of Homo sapiens. Their skeletons are basically indistinguishable from human skeletons of today. And they were able to make skillfully tools made of flint, So humans, over time, over this period of evolution, Homo sapiens developed erect posture, longer and more powerful thumb, developed manual dexterity, ability for close visual attention. Manual dexterity and refined vision resulted not only from human muscular system, but from human brain, also from finely adjusted nervous system. Like many other animals, humans possess intelligence that enables humankind to reason, also apply intuition. But human intelligence, probably unlike intelligence of other animals, has the capacity of thinking and communicating symbolically. And this ability to communicate symbolically allowed humans develop language. Basically, what is language? That's a symbolic communication. I communicate and I use symbols, I use sounds that represent certain things. That's a symbolic communication. So humans around 12,000 years BCE, before Common Era, or about 15,000 years ago, humans had evolved in physical appearance and mental capacity to roughly the same level as today. That's a reminder. We already talked about that. So people, Homo erectus, they produced crude stone tools. And the earliest way of life is called Paleolithic way of life, started. That's when people were producing crude stone tools. Roughly speaking, chronologically, that happened about 400,000 to 10,000 BCE, before Common Era. Or about 15,000 years ago, this Old Stone Age. Paleolith, it's a Greek term, and it means Old Stone Age. But it's not only like chronological thing, not only chronological phenomena, it basically refers to a way of life or culture. Because in present day world, some people, some cultures throughout the world still have that lifestyle and survive and exist as hunters and gatherers. So speaking in kind of scientific terminology, if we talk about the economy of this Paleolithic age, scholars are using this term food gathering economy. They gathered food in order to sustain their lives. They hunted animals or whatever they were fishing in order to sustain their life. They gathered nuts, roots, and berries. Their life was not sedentary. These people traveled from place to place, the so-called nomadic way of life, and they survived by hunting and gathering. Paleolithic people lived in caves, or in warmer climates, they built also shelters. Social and occupational roles were already divided according to gender. Males, men normally hunted. Women tended the fire, made clothes. They also tended children. Tool making became a kind, not just like a craft, but also it became a part of their economy and sort of business. They could exchange tools. They could sell, exchange tools for food or for other items, for garments and clothes produced by women in caves. The Neolithic, Paleolithic people lived in extended families and tribes. That would be a common sort of social type of social organization. Related extended families would form a clan, and related clans would form a tribe, and this is how people survive. Speaking about demography and numbers of people who lived during those times, during this time period, they're not numerous. They're just a few people. Unlike today, human population is huge. And they lived, as I've said, in caves and shelters. Lifespan was short because of diseases, and people didn't have any knowledge how to cure diseases. People were gaining knowledge. People were gaining knowledge about how to survive, how to sustain their lives. They're gaining knowledge about the environment. They try to make that environment useful for them. People were learning. People were developing their skills to survive, to sustain their lives. They produced decorative arts, and scholars, anthropologists believe that those arts were decorative in its purpose. They decorated caves. You have many examples of decorative arts from caves. They drew something what preoccupied them, those animals, sense of hunting. It's an example of cave painting here. Paleolithic sculpture. Scholars also believe that some of the sculpture perhaps have certain meaning or served certain purposes. Like this might be a goddess associated with the sculpturing, associated with fertility, what people in fact concerned about fertility. So they practiced, scholars believe that Paleolithic people practiced magic and religion. Perhaps they believed in spirits. And so that is about Paleolithic. Any questions, folks? Again, to reiterate what I've just said, Paleolithic way of life refers to this time period from around 400,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE, but it also means is a cultural phenomenon. That's a way of life. And in today's world, we have some cultures and societies that have that kind of lifestyle somewhere. They live by hunting and gathering. Speaking about the economy, we can talk about food gathering economy. What is also interesting, recent research by anthropologists and archaeologists suggests that sometimes people didn't hunt. They were chasing ferocious animals, and they would scare them away by using fire. Those lions and tigers who were real hunters, they would get some gain, and people would follow them, chase, scare away, and get that gain that ferocious animals got. They're real hunters. That probably happened. And finally, since women tended shelters, tended a fire, children, they were cooking food. And it is believed, or it's actually suggested by anthropologists, that women were responsible for that significant and fundamental and revolutionary change that brought about a new lifestyle, a new society, a new economy, what is known as Neolithic or agriculture. Neolithic revolution refers to the agriculture, basically, that people discovered agriculture. It was much less revolutionary, it was more evolutionary. When people accidentally dropped a seed and that produced a plant, and people realized that there is a possibility to grow crops, instead of hunting, there is a possibility to domesticate animals. So that process was quite continuous, and it took over thousands of years. That time period, the transition to Neolithic agriculture, is known as Mesolith, transitionary period. Took thousands of years till people fully adapted to agriculture. So, and what is, the process was evolutionary, but there was something truly revolutionary. Like what? Life became sedentary. They started building permanent settlements. Economy became food producing, different. And life, they set up agricultural settlements. Over time, life became more complex because people were needed to deal with their everyday life, and they had needs, and they needed to accommodate those needs. So life became more complex. What do you think, folks? Where did this happen, the Neolithic revolution and agricultural lifestyle? What places? Just speculate. It's a very simple answer to this question. Where did it happen? Near water, absolutely. Absolutely. Near water, where water resources were available, could be used, where basically environment favored agriculture. They started to cultivate land. They started to develop agriculture. Crops they adopted and began to cultivate always depended on the environment. In China, they cultivated rice. In the Near East, they cultivated millet, rye, wheat. In the Americas, and since we are in the America, right? So I will always refer to the Native American civilizations. They also experienced the Neolithic revolution. That transitionary time period was there when they adapted, and they began to cultivate crops specific to this continent. Native American people, Native American civilizations cultivated corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes. Those were absolutely American agricultural crops. They domesticated different kind of animals here in the Americas. They cultivated turkey, they domesticated turkeys, they domesticated pigs, whereas in the Eurasia, animals were domesticated in the Near East. They began to domesticate animals first, and that would later spread to other areas like Egypt. So life became more complex because they needed to address needs, all kinds of needs, like they need to protect themselves, since that was an agricultural settlement, and perhaps might be quite rich, and they definitely acquired some kind of material culture and wealth that some other folks wanted to take care of that, so they needed protection. So military would emerge. They also developed a whole system of religious beliefs, because people, they came to this world and they didn't know about anything. And they were surrounded with some kind of natural phenomena was always here, like rain and thunder, lightning, the sun was coming up and going down, the moon, the stars, and people were observing and they were curious. Where does it come from? The earliest people would explain that by referring that natural phenomena to something supernatural, to an act of some spirit, and they associated the sun with certain spirits. That's how religions emerged. So there are people, they start believing in deities and spirits and gods, and a number of people who communicated between gods and people, or spirits and people, performed religious rituals. They became known as priests. So priesthoods would also emerge. Military would emerge. People needed to create some kind of formal governments because they needed to address certain needs. They created governments, they created states. So life was becoming more complex during this period of the Neolithic time. The earliest towns were established or rose in Mesopotamia, in present-day in the Near East, Çatalhöyük or Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey, Jericho in present-day Palestine, Jarmo in present-day Iraq, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in present-day Pakistan. Those were like Mohenjo-daro was a well-planned city, built according to a certain plan. It had straight streets, paved streets. They used baked brick to build their homes. Canals, it did have some irrigation canals. So life became more complex and more complicated. And that way of life would spread. But how did it spread? In fact, it didn't happen that other hunters and gatherers elsewhere wanted to become agricultural, simply because this Neolithic population began to grow rapidly, because agriculture is labor intensive. It always needs labor in hands. So that was a pressure on population, and reproduction increased, the numbers were growing, and people needed arable lands. And they were moving and they were migrating. And when they migrated, they would introduce their agricultural way of life. So agricultural people, since their population tended to grow fast, they replenished the new Paleolithic people, which were few in numbers. That lifestyle simply would take over. When people with that migration of Neolithic people, that lifestyle would take over the Paleolithic way of life. So that's how that spread. Lifespan increased, perhaps because people learned more. They were learning over these thousands of years. They were learning how to cure diseases. And again, they perhaps discovered certain plants that could cure diseases. You know that animals are using plants to cure certain health problems, if you know that. Right? Have you heard about that? What did you hear? They're eating some grass, for instance. Yeah, they definitely. So people were also learning about that, and they discovered sometimes they would use spells and magic and religion to cure diseases also. So that's an artistic representation here. And again, a river is here, a water resource, some kind of perhaps irrigation canal that supplies the field with water, woman or tending children, man or a cultivator. Now the man became the cultivator here. Neolithic arts, you can see that people acquired more artistic skills and more knowledge. They were able to produce fine, clay containers or whatever, jars. In China, they discovered how to make porcelain. That's a Chinese thing. So that way of life would spread, and that map shows how the Neolithic way of life would spread throughout the world. It started in the Near East, in Egypt, in China, in Harappa, and would spread in all those regions. And it also started the Neolithic revolution occurred independently. That's what scholars suggest that occurred independently in many areas throughout Eurasia and the Americas that also happened independently from Eurasia. What is significant here, again, folks, since we are here in America, and I will always refer, when I talk about some general global developments, I will refer to the America because you are Americans here and you should know about the early Americas, and you should also be able to provide some kind of global context, which is important. So those civilizations in the Americas, they developed on its own because they were relatively isolated from Eurasia. They didn't have any access to that knowledge that old Eurasian and African civilizations produced. Knowledge in mathematics, in medicine, in astronomy. Chinese invented paper, invented China. The Harappans, or later actually, the Gupta India, invented what became known as the Arabic numerals. The Near East, Palestine, Phoenicians invented your alphabet. It is based on the Phoenician alphabet originally. Advancements and technological advancements invented here. The Americans didn't have any access to that knowledge. They didn't have any access to these ideas which had been produced in Eurasia. But they developed no less sophisticated knowledge by themselves. And at some point in their history, a Maya culture, a Maya civilization, were more advanced than medieval Europe. Medieval Europe looked quite backward compared to the Native American civilizations. But medieval Europe had an access to this early knowledge collectively produced by those old ancient Eurasian civilizations, and Europeans used that knowledge. And at some point they would surpass the American civilizations. And how did Europeans use that knowledge? An example, the Chinese invented gunpowder. And they used gunpowder for fireworks. And Europeans got that idea of gunpowder, and they began to use gunpowder for their rifles that would eventually enable Europeans to go and conquer the rest of the world. During the Columbus voyages, Vasco da Gama voyages, others voyages, they were able to take over the entire world because of that. But before that, Native American civilizations were way more developed. That is interesting to think about and to know about, folks. The earliest civilizations, or known as the River Valley civilizations, again, agriculture happened in these 4 areas in Eurasia independently. First, the earliest civilization happened or emerged in Mesopotamia, in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. old Mesopotamia and Babylonia, people began to experiment with agricultural crops here and domesticate animals here. Then a civilization emerged in the valley and delta of the Nile River, the Egyptian civilization. In the valleys of Indus and Gang River, a Harappan civilization was established, the earliest, the native civilization that emerged on the Indian subcontinent. And the Yellow and Gang River, Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, the Chinese civilization developed. The river valley civilizations, agricultural activities were favored by climate, by the environment. In all those areas, Nile, for instance, flooded twice a year with precision, and when the waters were gone, they left fertile mud behind that enabled these people here to produce crop twice a year. Here, Tigris and Euphrates River, the Indus River, the Yellow River around, so these are river valley civilizations. And finally, the Neolithic lifestyle, and I was using that word, a civilization, many times, it gave rise to the civilization. Life became more complex. Well, let me say this. Civilization is a kind of artificial construct, scientific in a way construct that social scientists and humanists are using, and it has a certain characteristic that if a society or culture share those characteristics, that means that society is a civilization. But again, the word itself is artificial. What's the opposite of civilization? Barbarian, and that term comes from the from the ancient Rome. Romans called, and Greeks also, they called all others as barbarian or uncivilized. And what is civilized? So civilization is defined by when a society attains a high level of societal complexity. What does that mean? It means that there are cities, towns, larger states. Like again, speaking about the Native American civilizations, we can talk about Mayan cities or Tenochtitlan, for instance, Aztec Empire, Inca cities, centralized and bureaucratic governments, social classes and castes. Again, we will explore on concrete examples when we will talk about Mesopotamia and Egypt. It will give you more concrete examples of social classes, how did they come around, and castes, which is also a kind of social class, but people are born to a certain caste, and it's also a religious kind of, there's some religious aspects behind castes. We will explore that when we will talk about the when Aryans invaded India and migrated and took over Harappa, that castes were formed there, and we will talk about that. Civilization is also characterized by technological advances. People needed to control water, they needed to supply their agricultural fields with water, and they developed certain tools and technology to supply their fields with water. Or they also, people right away, people became somewhat militaristic, and had armies, and they would develop military technology to conduct their military activities. So that also characterizes a civilization. Trade would take place. There is an evidence in Mesopotamia that it traded with Egypt, with Harappa. Harappa traded with China and Mesopotamia. A system of writing, that's what most scholars are pointing to, a system of writing as a characteristic of a civilization. But I must clarify here, because a system of writing is something quite specific, whereas the Inca culture didn't produce any system of writing, but it's no less a civilization. Would you agree, folks? The Inca, that was a civilization. But they had a system to communicate data, to communicate information. So instead of a system of writing, I would say a system of communicating information. That's what really characterizes a civilization, because there's some other means to communicate some information instead of writing. Patterns could communicate knowledge. And also, a civilization produced monumental and representative arts. That arts represented people, represented a civilization, represented that civilization's rulers, kings or warriors or an army, or represented gods and deities that civilization worshipped. You will find numerous examples of representative and monumental arts when we will talk about the ancient Near East, when we will talk about the Assyrian Empire. They produced monumental arts, and their arts was quite specific. Their arts glorified the military, glorified murder, glorified violence, glorified bloodshed. So very specific art, glorified the military and the army of Assyria. So that's about what is a civilization. Is everything clear, folks? What is not clear? Anything new that you've just learned and you haven't known before? What's new here for you? You've just learned. Tell me. Yeah.
Civilization started around rivers.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And then they would spread. What else, guys? Anything new you just learned? Why it's so noisy? Outside is noisy. Just like a party right behind this wall. It's not good. I need to inform some authorities here because it's destructive. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, folks, now I have questions for you. The questions would be about our reading document, the Neolithic Iceman. So, what about this ice? Was it interesting read, folks? Tell me, was interesting? What's interesting was here?
Um, so the thing is, they said that it would have been, the guy would have been killed by ice, but it's actually an arrow had struck him. So they don't know like what could, like who could have done it. Was it on purpose?
Right.
Was it accidental? Was it intentional or not? One of those things. I had a guess on like he might have still been alive with their pierced, but he was trying to run away.
Right, possibly.
That's just my guess.
Good guess. Anyone else? What can we learn about people who lived during that time period? Were they different from us? And in what way? Yes.
I believe in comparison to like the technology that we have today, like just kind of looking back as to like how they lived back then.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to infer like what they had to do in order to survive.
Absolutely. Survival strategies are always here. But time defines the way and instruments people use to survive. Nowadays we have much more means to survive. What else, folks, that you want to say? Something striking, yes.
I thought it was interesting his teeth were tinted blue.
Yes. Why was that?
The food.
Food. Yeah, absolutely. Food. What else, guys? Anyone else wants to say something about the Iceman?
And he had arrows. Like
Arrows. Any hints on food he might consume? Yes.
For the food, wasn't it milled grain?
Yeah, milled grain.
And this wasn't my original observation; it was somebody else's question that I found really interesting.
Yeah.
That even though he was murdered, the person whoever murdered him like did not take his valuable items. Like
Right.
he left behind the axe and
Right.
the clothes and arrows that they could have used. So, and it made me wonder like what was the motive of that?
Right.
It wasn't
Well,
to-
but here is a question: was that a murder or not? Maybe that happened by the accident. Accident.
found, like, in his
Yes, because that actually happens during like warfare. You know that someone might got a bullet from one's own side
Yeah.
accidentally.
they might have thought he was an animal.
Yes.
Prisoner.
The what?
Prisoner.
Prisoner. Prisoner of what?
I mean, some like a prisoner or death execution.
Uh-huh.
Something like that. Because if he left his values at a different
Right.
place, they could have just exiled him or something.
Did you try to answer those questions? What does the autopsy of the corpse indicate about a society in which the Iceman lived? Society in general. Well, it was like you can say it was a Neolithic society because of grain. But at the same time, it was still some involvement in hunting and gathering that he might involve. So it may be a transitionary period, Mesolithic transition to Neolithic agriculture. All right, guys, on this note, we will finish today's lecture. Y'all have a great rest of the day. Y'all have a great weekend. Try to have the most productive weekend. Be safe, and I'll see you next week on Tuesday.